Thank you. So to start, I'll just echo the last thing that Liz said, which is that there was some conversation, particularly in our first group, where we had more chance to range around a little bit about where we want to be versus where we were starting. And of course, on all of our sheets, we started with this year's budget, and there were lots of conversations about how that might compare to what a vision for an ideal Alaska might be. I just want to pull out a few high points. So first off, when we added it all up at the end and looked at the ratio of critical to medium to low, overall, services are viewed as critical, important, or at least of some import in the medium category. In our stakeholder group, we had a ratio of about 3-to-1 between services that were viewed as critical and services that had perhaps a low value. In our non-stakeholder group, it was even higher than that. It was 5-to-1. And when you add the mediums in there as well, overwhelmingly, people feel that the services that were being included in the agencies that we were discussing were quite important. The agencies that we were discussing, Department of Revenue, also support from OMB, and we are talking about things like the functioning of the permanent fund, the functioning of the PERS and TERS systems, the functioning of the Mental Health Trust Authority. These aren't necessarily services that we're going to take away, but people really valued them. One of the pieces of feedback that we got is as you're trying to make an assessment to get a sense of the scale of the budget numbers that we had on our sheets relative to the value that's provided by some of these functioning. So for example, we have the ARM board, which is dealing with the retirement management system, having a $70 million budget this past year, but in management having $30 billion. And so the advice, especially coming out of our first group, was as the administration continues to go out and have these conversations, lead these conversations in the coming year, to try to identify places where some additional nuance in helping the general public understand the difference or the relationship between some of these numbers and the function provided would be quite important. The big difference that we saw, oddly, our stakeholder group really felt that oil tax credits were going okay. There was a lot of conversation around them that I won't even get into, but our non-stakeholder group in general felt like we had too much going on in oil tax credits, but then in conversation said that they also didn't necessarily feel qualified to be making determinations about that because they weren't subject area experts. So I think that was a clear place where you could see the stakeholder aspect playing out. On the flip side, our non-stakeholder group really, really valued the services provided by Alaska Housing Finance Corporation. It was critical, 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 whereas the non-stakeholder group was more, it's okay. I would also point out that a lot of the mediums that came out of our stakeholder group, there was an assessment that there was too much resource going to them. And on further discussion, it turned out that it wasn't that they weren't viewed as critical or viewed as important to state government, but that there was a perception that efficiencies could be found, which makes sense when you consider that this was our stakeholder group that perhaps has more insight into some of the real nitpicky aspects of how some of these funds are being managed. So I think for me overall, it took away, my takeaway was that we have some excellent resources in these rooms, particularly in our stakeholder groups, people that can help us with the nuanced understanding and help the administration carry forward nuanced messages to support conversations about the future. And also, judging from the non-stakeholder group, that Alaskans are going to be willing to listen to new information and change their opinions or shift their views based on the information they can get from their peers.
What she said.